Google's most expensive phone of 2024 was the last to hit the market, but now, some 3 months after release, just what's it like to live with the Pixel 9 Pro Fold? Well, this is our longer term look at Google's latest folding Pixel phone. So right out of the gate, Google has done an incredible job of hiding a tablet in a phone form factor with this device. I actually couldn't get the porcelain colour right at launch, so I actually opted for the plainer obsidian, and I will say the matte frame and that matte backplate do look gorgeous. And it's a bit of a wonder why Google didn't actually stick with that across the entire Pixel lineup this year. I do think it does look really striking, but it does help separate this from those other devices. I actually initially used a case with this phone, but like many people out there, I've had issues with screen protectors on that front display, so I actually picked up a skin instead, as it gives it a little bit of protection. Side note, I think given its niche market position, there are just not that many great quality accessories for this phone this year, and as such, I will say I'm being super careful and trying not to put the phone in precarious situations. And on a recent trip to the beach, I just simply ditched the Fold in favour of the Pixel 9. I just wasn't confident enough to do so, because I think one grain of sand in that folding mechanism could really spell disaster. Plus, on top of that, that lesser IP rating that comes with this device has really played on my mind, especially being from a fairly rainy old England here. Despite being ultra cautious, I will say that the Pixel 9 Pro Fold is a tougher cookie than I ever expected. I have dropped it a few times, nothing too major, but there's no major marks or dings on this device, at least just yet. I'll also add that the inner screen, after a long period of usage, is really a smear magnet. I don't know if it's because of the glass structure being used here, but the bonus is that it does actually hide these smears quite well, because when the screen is on, it gets super bright, it's super clear, and it's easily, I think, probably one of the best foldable displays I've ever had the pleasure of using. And I think it highlights just how good Google is good at tuning a phone screen, at least these days. And I'm actively using my phone more because of that larger size and that gorgeous screen, as I mentioned. The bezels are slightly bigger, but you can kind of account for that because of the frame itself. It's just a twofold bonus, pun intended there. One thing that I have found myself really enjoying though is the power button fingerprint scanner. I didn't think I would actually like this as much. It's incredibly reliable and way faster than any in-display scanner I've ever used on a phone previously. The only downside is that when I reach into my pocket, I actually find that I accidentally unlock the device itself with my thumb quite regularly because I grab around that area of the phone. I actually set this auto lock to 1 minute to try and mitigate this, and there's also some other options in Android you can tune on. I also think that while this itself is great in and of itself, I think it's limiting as well because you can only use a few fingers, or only a few fingers are suited to unlocking your phone, so you might use your left index finger or your right thumb. Beyond that, I think it's a little bit different or a little bit awkward to unlock with other digits, and that's something that is worth noting. I will say the speakers and the haptic feedback have been a real step down though. I must admit, to me, I consider myself a bit of a haptic aficionado right from the very get-go. I still love the vibration-based feedback here, don't get me wrong, it's really good. It's it's within the ballpark figure of the best on Android, but due to the thinner profile of the device when it's open, you just don't get the oomph that other Pixel phones can provide. The same can be said for booming audio. I do think the audio is very good, but it helps highlight the compromises that have been made to accommodate what is effectively two devices in the one chassis. Let's not beat around the bush too much longer. I will say this is just a gorgeous phone. I think it's a gorgeous hunk of metal and glass combining some of the best of Google of the last few years. It looks and feels the part, and I do think after time, the longer I've been spending with this, it is something that I come back to time and time again. Just when I pick it up, I think it's a really, really nice piece of tech. Naturally, we all know a foldable needs to have more than just the ability to look good. It needs the ability to do things like open two apps side by side by default. I do think on top of that actual option, it's one of the major frustrations with the Pixel 9 Pro Fold the longer I've used it, at least as a multitasking device. I think for most people, myself included, this probably isn't going to be an issue, but I think it feels like a missed opportunity for Google not to add some sort of multi-window solution with that Android 15 update, which did arrive after this phone released on probably the one device that feels catered to the people who would undoubtedly use such a function on a day-to-day basis. Not all apps, though, like actually being side by side. Reddit is a prime example. When I've been using it, it just sometimes becomes unresponsive and rejects touches and input. On the other hand, I will say I do love that we get that pseudo full-size Chrome experience with proper Chrome tabs, and this makes using the web browser and putting these tabs side by side, which is one of the few applications that can do this, so much more useful. When I'm doing things like shopping or searching, I can do things like compare items within tabs, and that alone has been incredible for productivity as someone who's traditionally preferred a candy bar style device. Some other things are a little annoying with the software on the Pixel 9 Pro Fold that have irked me over the time, even since Android 15's arrived. I do think that dual column quick settings panel just isn't all that useful. It puts toggles in a position that feel a little bit more out of reach on that inner screen. I honestly think the taskbar could also be better utilised to have some form of quick settings integrated into it when you do see that from the recents menu. And while I would love one, I'm not explicitly asking for a desk or a DeX-like desktop mode. I think merely a few accommodations that take better advantage of that larger inner screen would be welcome. The device does know that the display is fully open because it's contextually aware, so I would say that the context probably isn't that hard to determine if a feature or some features were to take advantage or better advantage of that in display. I think these complaints do apply to the Pixel Tablet 2, so don't get me wrong. I think that device itself also suffers from big screenitis, as I'd like to coin it, and it just feels like it doesn't quite have the true adjustments that make the larger usable surface area probably as useful as it could be. There isn't really a killer feature for a Google Foldable, at least at this time, even although we've only had 2 of them so far. I think Pixel Weather, for instance, is nicer with more information on the go, but beyond that, I have to say I'm clutching at straws here for a true killer feature. I'm also treading some old ground here, but lots of applications scale and look great, but some do still need a little more work to be considered perfect for that almost 1-to-1 aspect ratio on that inner display. Even some of Google's apps flip-flop due to that square shape. Some apps lose the sidebar unless you physically rotate the screen, which is quite confusing. And I have a very love-hate relationship with lots of applications, eBay in particular. It scales nicely on devices like the Pixel Tablet, but it's a bit broken on the Pixel 9 Pro Fold due to the non-standard aspect ratio, and that's something I've had to become accustomed to over the past few months. Another issue that I hadn't anticipated was the need to refresh or even resize some applications to get them working at all on that inner display. I'm not actually sure where the blame lies here, if it's individual app developers or Google themselves. Frustration aside, I have found myself engaged in a lot of applications that work, and when I get them working, and especially those that I already spend too much time on, and even some apps that I ordinarily hate on smaller screens or smaller smartphone screens like LumaFusion, I think it's just been so much nicer to use to make basic video edits on mobile, for example, and it's one of the reasons why I have been coming back time and time again to this device. I will say, obviously, I've just painted a very negative picture of the Pixel 9 Pro Fold software experience here, but most applications work just fine, and it's lovely to get more information on your screen because of that larger size. The best bit is that if it isn't perfect on the inner display, you can just switch to that outer screen and it works like a normal smartphone, so the problem is solved 99.9% of the time if you do that. This is a substantial nitpick, but I don't think it distracts too much from the performance of the device. I've had the exact same experience as any Pixel over the past couple of years, which is both a positive and negative in equal measure. Android 15, as I noted very, very briefly just a moment ago, has improved performance. I wouldn't say drastically, but there has been an uplift here. You do have you have the highest end of what the Tensor chipset is capable of, 16 gigabytes of RAM. So you know the deal. You're going to be loading through applications fairly quickly, despite the fact it's still UFS 3.1 storage. I do think Google needs to fix that. The zipping around is fairly smooth, though 120Hz refresh rate really ties in here, and it's just a typically slick Pixel experience. I have found some things a little bit annoying in terms of the UI, but overall the core of this is still as good as you expect from what is technically a first-party foldable running Android. I'm also very aware that for $1,700, it's probably too much to pay for a Tensor-powered phone. It's very, very much at the limit. I think we should get top-tier performance at that price with no real excuses. At this point, some people probably will have turned off, or at least be turned off by the Pixel 9 Pro Fold. I still haven't felt like I need huge power overhead, but I'd be lying if I said that I wouldn't be happy to have a little more power with some future-proofing with this device. But as it stands, things are really good. Android 15 has made the experience a marginally better than it was on Android 14. So after a few months of abusage, is that a word? Well, anyway, the Pixel 9 Pro Fold has likely learned a lot of my habits, my daily usage habits, and I think I'd call it a dependable companion. If I stick to the outer screen most of the day, which I do think is predominantly my experience, I do go in and out of the outer screen and the inner screen, I think its lifespan is practically identical to that of the regular Pixel 9. Is that enough? I think for me, yes. For you, maybe it won't be. It's around 6 hours of screen on time for what it's worth, although I do think that is a very bad metric in the grand scheme of things. I think mixing the front and inner screen does cause me a little more stress, at least a little more regularly, as I end up, or at least I tend to end up in power saving mode by 10 to 11 PM, which is a long day after taking it off around 7 AM. To that end, I have had this device die overnight without sticking it on charge following a regular charging cycle. So that means 0 to 1% from bedtime to the morning. And that was when I put it on my bedside table at 10% battery level, and I forgot to plug it in for what it's worth. So that's something to bear in mind if you don't plug it in before you go to bed. I also guess if you're solely using that in a display, you might have a very different experience entirely because it's a bigger screen to power with that battery, which is technically smaller than the previous gen. It's around about 4,600-ish milliamp hours. I think Tensor seems way better at power management this year as a chipset, and it's practically impossible though to say how you might get on, given how different everyone's use cases could be. I do think it's very dependable for the most part, but some people out there, it might not be enough. It's just the way it is. I do think the next iteration needs faster charging though, as I found out that 21 watt wired charging does take a long time to actually fully top this device up compared to my other devices. And although there are issues with the Pixel Stand, that 7.5 watt wireless charging again is slow, but I'm plugging this in most of the time anyway, and I think most of you will probably do the same as a result of that slower wireless charging. It's a little bit confusing in the battery stakes and the charging stakes, but for the most part, it's fine. That's the best way I can describe it. So I like the camera system on the Pixel 9 Pro Fold, but effectively I'm testing this or treating this as the Pixel 8a system with a telephoto tacked on. And being real for a second, that previous system from the mid-range phone is still great for taking photos, but considering you actually miss out on tons of features here, like 8K video or 20 times super res zoom when recording, I think it is a bit of a bitter pill to swallow. There is a minor decrease in the image fidelity coming from this phone directly from the Pixel 9 or the 9 Pro XL, which most of you probably wouldn't do. From another device, I think it's harder to say what you'll think of the Fold's camera capabilities. You'll have to make that decision for yourself. The extra megapixels and larger sensor on the Pixel 9 does add a little extra, at least to my eye, because I'm coming directly from those. It's most noticeable with a tad more noise and decreased dynamic range on the 9 Pro Fold, but overall I do think you get those punchy pixel images with just a tad less detail. So you'll have to decide for you if that is enough. I'll say I'm not frustrated, put it that way. However, I would have loved Google to add a bit more thickness to this device. It is a slim phone overall, but to try and just slip in that full fat Pixel 9 Pro camera system into this specific form factor, I think it wouldn't hurt to at least try and fit it into the next generation. Something I hadn't anticipated though is how the inner selfie camera position actually shifting up to that top right position affects the way you make or take video calls or even take selfies. Not that I'm the kind of person who takes a lot of selfies anyway, at least sensible selfies. The upper right position I think is just absolutely awful for day-to-day usage. So I actually stick to the front screen for video calling and the odd time when I do take a sensible, as I say in air quotes, selfie picture. One feature I've never thought I'd use but I actually found to be a killer addition in the real world though is the made you look function. So some of my close friends have had young children recently, and this has been one of those real world features that actually works. So getting a 6-month-old to pay attention to a camera was really amazing in actual practice, and it made taking family photos for some of my friends out there something I'm sure lots of parents out there will love to hear, just a breeze, as everyone was paying attention at the same time. I do think it's a really nice one of those quality of life additions that Google is adding to their devices that not many other people are potentially thinking about anyway. To wrap up the camera system though, I do think if you can kind of deal with some downgrades, you'll be very, very happy with this camera system. It's not incapable, it's just a slight step down over the top tier Pixel series from last year and from this year. So after a few months of using the Pixel 9 Pro Fold as my main device and then sometimes as my secondary to the Pixel 9 Pro XL and whatever Pixel 9 device I'm using, I have to say I don't think this is a phone that I can recommend or someone out there can recommend to everyone. It's for true blue nerds, those of us that have salivated at the prospect of a dual purpose device that is simultaneously a phone and a small tablet in one compact package. My only problem is that while you get a lot of what makes the Pixel 9 series a sizable step forward, you get in the middle ground in a lot of other areas, or almost all other areas. No, it doesn't have the best outright display or camera system. They're very good, and you don't get class-leading battery longevity either. Those are 3 things, for instance. But given this is a almost $2,000 phone, I think it's a big financial outlay for what you're considering the middle of a little bit of everything. We all know that the real appeal of this device is its changing form factor. But you've got to ask yourself, does an extra screen instantly make this a pro with all those other compromises due to that change in shape? I have to say I'm not so sure, but all foldable phones are kind of in this strange market position, as none out there really offer objectively the best hardware for their higher asking prices. So it's a bit harsh to just critique Google for this. I think having used practically every other Google Pixel phone out there, and especially in recent years, I've come to realise that the lineup is increasingly more than just a sum of their parts. And I think the Pixel 9 Pro Fold probably exemplifies that more than any other phone I've used over the last few years. Deep down, I know that I should prefer using the Pixel 9 Pro or the Pro XL. The thing is, I've kept coming back to this dual form factor foldable phone, and it's hard to truly explain why. Honestly, I don't think it's worth it for most buyers unless, like me, you fall into that aforementioned tiny sliver of people who must have that shiniest trinket and that dual form factor. The Pixel 9 Pro is still the best in the lineup for me because it straddles a lot of the bases and doesn't compromise as much as the Fold. It's also $700 cheaper, and I think that gives you some wiggle room to pick up more accessories like even a pair of earbuds, a watch, and a standalone tablet if you want a big screen on top of that to boot. Even so, I have to say there is something really hard to quantify about the Pixel 9 Pro Fold that you probably won't be aware of until you try it for yourself, and you'll go online, trust me, you'll hear other people saying the same. After a few months, I will say the sheen, it just hasn't really dulled.